Hello and welcome to the New Books Network. I'm Pierre Denancer. If we were to take the cue from the media, men haven't had the greatest of decades. Narratives of toxic masculinity, the patriarchy, or movements like Me Too have made a significant dent in the currency of men. On the other hand, patriarchy or macho figures such as Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin have cultivated followings that are difficult to read as pertaining to sex rather than to politics. Along all this, a battle over the definitions and relevance of sex and gender is ongoing. With all this, what does it mean to be a man? And what does it mean to be a good man? What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents by Nina Power considers these questions with a degree of optimism rarely seen in feminist literature. Nina is a philosopher, critic, and a cultural theorist. Her 2009 book One Dimensional Woman has been translated into multiple languages. I'm very happy that Nina joins me now for an interview that is likely not to pass the Bechdel test. Nina, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Pierre.
Nina, we're going to discuss your book, What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents. And your previous book was called One Dimensional Woman. So I have two questions. What is it with you and men and women? And what is it with you and puns?
Well, I enjoy a good joke, and I thought it would be amusing to turn the tables on these two very famous phrases from male thinkers. So obviously, one-dimensional woman is a joke about one-dimensional man, which isn't actually what Marcuse says in German, because Mensch is human rather than man, but it's a joke about the English translation. So one-dimensional woman is a joke about that, and obviously What Do Men Want is a reference to Freud's infamous question, what does a woman want, or what does woman want? And I thought it'd be amusing. And I suppose on the other question, I think that sexual difference is very interesting and worth discussing.
Well, should we try to do that? I just want to disclose for listeners that Nina and I are friends, and this is probably take 5 of us giggling together in Nina's office. And I hope that this won't mean that I'll be more soft with any of my questions than usually. In fact, I'm hoping to have an argument with Nina in a moment about the contents of her book and a few other things that she might have said to me off the record, ill-advisedly. But before we get into any of this, maybe it would be a good idea to try to set out the situation which you try to confront with the book. You open the book with the bold assertion that men and women exist, bold, of course, in scare quotes. Where are we? Why does it continue to be necessary to talk about men? Why is it necessary to continue talking about women, given that we seem to have done very little else for the last 40 years?
Well, I think there's sort of been a kind of confusion that's happened at the level of thinking about sex and gender, which has had all kinds of unpleasant effects. Gender is not a word that exists in many languages, in fact, but it has become very dominant in the Anglosphere. And I suppose as we move into a kind of more immaterial and virtual age, the turn against the body and reality has become rather extreme in some quarters. And I think actually depressingly so. I think a lot of people feel absolutely terrible about being embodied as a man or a woman. And I'm interested in how we can change that so that we can make people reconciled to their sex rather than feel miserable all the time. And I do think there are important differences between men and women that are being ignored in favor of a kind of fantasy realm and the realm of identity, which doesn't really bear any relation to reality. So I think we need to go back to thinking about sex as real and saying that it matters and that embodiment is central to who we are. We are our bodies. It doesn't mean that we are therefore reduced to our bodies, as sometimes people disingenuously think when we talk about biological sex. But rather it's a fact whose the way in which we live it out is up to us. But we can't escape it. And I think attempting to escape it leads to more harm than good.
let's try to define some of the problems with which you try to contend, because the book doesn't stray into this realms of fantasies or ideology too much, even though quite a lot of the phenomena that you observe do have some kind of ideological connotation. But your book comes at the back of maybe a bit of a trend for naming and shaming things like toxic masculinity, at the back of the Me Too movement, which has had, fortunes and misfortune, has made changes to the way that people think about masculinity, how men are expected to think about themselves. And it's far from clear what effects in any uniform way these kind of movements just have had on men. Should we start by understanding what a man is? Like, what kind of man are you talking about? Because that's a question that's so wide that to make some kind of generalization is almost as futile as trying to make a generalization about all women.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, men exist. It's a biological reality. Human beings are sexually dimorphic. There are two kinds of humans, and we're all each one or other of them, including people with disorders of sexual identity who are development, sorry, who are basically always male or female, fundamentally. So there's no third sex. There's no position. There's no alien observer. We all live out our lives as one of each sex, and I think the generalizations actually come from the culture. I mean, obviously, asking or trying to answer the question of what men want is a kind of joke. Of course, it's
Hmm.
impossible. I don't really give a final answer as if there could be one. But what I'm responding to is the kind of generalizations that have become dominant, that seem to often suggest, particularly in the left and liberal media, that somehow all men are tainted by their manliness, that there are no good ways of being a man, that all masculinity is kind of inherently dangerous or awful, must be changed, that men should feel guilty, that there should be even forms of reparation. That we're at a historical moment at which men are supposed to reckon with their supposed privilege. And there's just been a kind of general permission granted for a kind of historical assault on men. And I'm interested in a more reasonable and balanced take, which reflects better the reality of people's lives, which is to say, for most women and for most men, their encounters with other men are generally positive or at least ambivalent. And lots of women, for example, would love their fathers and their brothers and their male friends and would be in nice relationships sometimes with men. So I wanted to suggest that there is room for a positive notion of masculinity, and that some of the ways in which men are being discussed in terms of privilege and toxicity and the patriarchy are sort of inadequate for understanding other things, which would include class, for example.
Oh, well, I'm definitely grateful as a man, if I can out myself at this moment, that you are taking my side and running to my defense so much. But you've just ended on what I was going to ask you about, which is the critical potential of some of the terminologies and the whole theorizing industry that masculinity and feminism is currently involved in. So you devote one of the chapters in the book to the idea of patriarchy, and you more or less go on to suggest that it's a construct that kind of has outlived some of its usefulness. But I wonder if you see any positive potential and kind of in the realm of, in your own interest, of realism of doing politics between the sexes, whether there are aspects of some of the more combative conversations that are still somehow useful in developing the field that you are interested in.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think patriarchy is also itself a positive term in some ways, whether it's analytically useful or otherwise. I think its mainstream use is largely kind of inoperative, but I think it also indicates a kind of absence or a question to do with responsibility and who takes responsibility for who or what. The old fashioned idea of the patriarch is the kind of head of the household, but it's also like characters in the Bible who are looking after generations, if you like. And actually, we're kind of absent of those sorts of figures in many ways. We're quite a fatherless society, and we live more like brother and sister, which is to say, more like rivals,
Mhm.
and which is kind of encouraged by a sort of consumerism, which pits us against each other. and also in terms of employment, more or less all the jobs can be done indifferently by men or women, and sexual difference isn't really very important for most contemporary jobs, although men tend to still do the most dangerous jobs. There's not much equality there. I think, one of the important things for me is to always say that women are not victims, women are not children, women are also adults. And that if we have conversations about violence and sex and all these things, that we don't reduce it simply to a kind of opposition between some kind of, creepy, abusive, violent
Mm.
set of people on the one hand and some kind of pathetic, victimized creatures on the other. And I think the question of power and what status is, even if we want to say that the world is patriarchal in certain ways, this doesn't exhaust what we mean by power, and I think women have a lot of power. We might also want to ask ourselves whether what we value in our own lives. Do we really think that becoming a woman becoming a CEO of a business, is really the height of feminist achievement, or are there in fact lots of other things that we're much more interested in that would actually be much more liberating and wouldn't involve the same kind of status games that a lot of people feel compelled to play?
It's quite interesting. It strikes me reading the book and now listening to you as well. That it's not quite a paradox, but it reads like a paradox. That at one point you want to reaffirm a certain binary, the binary of the sexes, but somehow reject some of the apparatuses which grow on that. Some of the binaries, the kind of Manichaean, good and bad approaches. And I think that's something that I find you incredibly optimistic in, but also I'm left with quite a lot of questions, because on the one hand we can, I think, agree that we are in the mainstream left with a very skewed understanding of what men and women represent, because we are drawn to look at the extremes, whatever they are, and those are obviously politically constructed and aided by neoliberalism in a kind of defeating way. But at the same time, if you want to maintain that biological difference exists, check, I'm not arguing there at all. It is also, to a certain extent, necessary to allow space for for the difference to produce those extremes. How do we deal with that? And maybe also at the same time, like, what is your kind of ideal case scenario? What is your vision for a harmonious way of living that avoids this too much, avoids this becoming the main issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned from the weight of human civilization. I think we live in a very stupid age that imagines that it's the most intelligent age and is precisely stupid because it thinks this. And I think people are bewitched and bewildered by technology, and they assume that they're kind of modern and somehow beyond the same kind of feelings and emotions that human beings have always had. Whereas I think actually in different times and different places, there were multiple kinds of virtues and ways of living together that we've kind of almost completely abandoned in the name of a sort of banal desire and the sort of unspoken assumption or the axiom of liberalism, which is that desire is good and people should do whatever feels good. And this obviously mitigates against forms of pro-social behavior, which often involve thinking about other people. And I think this becomes a big issue when we're talking about people having families and taking care of each other and themselves, um, in favor of a kind of deeply encouraged infantilism and a kind of perpetual adolescence, which is what the society sort of promotes in many ways, I think. Um, so I think we need to look back at different cultures and not from this perspective of moral judgment or condemnation, and to say that all of these situations were patriarchal, therefore bad, and that somehow we've transcended these questions. I think there are lots of different ways of interacting between men and women which are more or less playful. And so, for example, the ancient Greeks understood that to be strong wasn't simply to be physically violent, it was, in fact, knowing when to deploy violence. So it was a question of judgment, and things that were valued included courage and loyalty. And these are values and virtues that anyone can possess, of course. But I was particularly interested in what it might mean to think about being a good man today. And so moving away from this kind of universal condemnation idea, this kind of original sin of manliness, and saying, well, what would it actually mean to be better and to be a good man and to encourage men to think of themselves as improvable and not bound by this kind of this sort of minimizing culture, and also to help other men to avoid men also becoming too isolated and atomized and therefore resentful and potentially violent. So I'm also interested in solving this problem of male violence as well.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned now the idea of improvement, and you mention in a book a whole industry of self-help, which I guess is an industry that doesn't quite discriminate between men and women. Everyone is allowed to spend their pennies on feeling better for 10 minutes before they reach for yet another book. But to a certain extent, the idea that men would be improved from within seems to be a little bit taboo at the moment. For some reason, figures like Jordan Peterson, who's one of the characters in your book, is almost universally vilified by feminists or circles in the left. And whatever way I want to think about Jordan Peterson, there is a level at which all he does is offer some kind of quite basic and quite simplistic moral guidance to a generation of men who I think quite fairly can be claimed to be lost, to be, as you said, kind of fatherless to a certain extent. So how do you see the potential of these kind of very basic messages? Like how do we spread the good word without reverting to either moralizing historical views or kind of religious fervor that quite often is the subject of critique and is misunderstood to lead into all sorts of cultish behaviors.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think maybe, moralism or religion would even be better than than liberalism. But yeah, I mean, I tried to say why, for example, someone like Peterson is very popular. It's important, I think, to understand what people see in him, and I think it is this kind of patrician father. Yes, what he says is kind of basic, but actually, most of us need that kind of basic thing to be told to us, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I suggest that in fact, what Jordan Peterson and others in his sort of world realm suggest is actually beneficial to women, because one of the things that he suggests is that men should sort themselves out, and they shouldn't rely on other women or, a girlfriend or mothers to do all the work for them. In fact, they should become autonomous and sort their own life out, which actually takes the resentment away from the missing woman or the woman who's supposed to be doing all the work. So actually, I think it's kind of helpful. And I think for everybody, it's like this question of like, who does your health belong to? Which is a very political question, and particularly in the last 2 years, it's like, does your health belong to the state or does it belong to you? And what can you do to sort of, if you like, look after yourself without kind of blaming the culture around you or always giving in to your desire or, becoming an addict or whatever. And I think the kind of self-help that's directed at men is often about getting them out of these negative patterns of behavior, whether it's to do with porn addiction or drinking and saying or drugs or whatever, and saying instead, no, you can actually take hold of your own life, you can take responsibility for yourself. And in fact, by doing this, it's only by doing this will you be in any position to offer a woman, if that's what you want, any form of something that she might desire. And obviously we're talking largely about straight, relationships here. It's interesting, when I was looking at the relationship between the kind of the gym culture and this kind of culture of fitness, sometimes men would start off doing it because they wanted a girlfriend, and then at a certain point it just became an end in itself, like it would just became enjoyable for its own sake, and that actually it was about hanging out with other men and just enjoying the company of men, and so it took it out of that kind of desire or need for finding a partner.
I'm still thinking about the way in which quite a lot of the conversation that usually starts with Jordan Peterson but ends up being a rant against the alt-right ends up seeing the kind of homosocial relationship that you describe, the people who go to the gym and are just into that for its own sake, like they get rolled up into this whole discourse about radicalism, white supremacy, and incels. I've been thinking about incels, and I've been looking at some of the mainstream research on incel culture recently, and I've been finding, like my instinct is that we get quite a lot of this wrong. Do you have a theory of why these things come so closely together?
Yeah, so I guess there's quite a prominent discourse in left liberal media which
Mm.
suggests that the manosphere, the idea of the red pill, seeing the world as it actually is, as they would put it, and that the kind of bodybuilding culture and the no fap movement, which is to do with men wanting to stop watching pornography and stop being dominated by their urge to masturbate, which I think is very positive if people want to stop doing that. These are often portrayed, and this idea of incels, these involuntary celibate men who are supposedly potentially violent, and there have been a few very rare instances of men who are associated with incels, although it's not a group, it's not like there's a membership card. So
Hmm.
you always have this issue about whether someone is something, if you see what I mean. It's like this person did some terrible action. Is it the responsibility of a supposed forum
Yeah,
or
it's
something?
perfectly possible to be single and depressed and not have that hashtag in their profile.
Yeah,
No,
sure,
it's
exactly. So there's kind of all these kind of usual questions of cultural causation, which have been going on forever. If you listen to, I don't know, particular music, are you more likely to be violent and so on? So, but I think that there is a tendency to on the left and left liberal media to both want people to demonize, like you're allowed to, for example, hate people who hate. This is permitted
Mm.
hatred. So if you say that there's a group of men who say hate women, then you're allowed to hate them. I think there is a way in which these dispossessed young men who are often very poor and working class, living in very deprived areas where there aren't really many jobs. There's a very good documentary by Alex Lee Moyer on incels called TFW No GF, where she interviews some men who would associate with that movement, and they're very funny and very self-deprecating, and they often live in very depressed parts of America, not in the liberal main cities, and they have a very different experience of reality than the people who are attacking them. So I don't know. There's a way in which it's sort of okay to bash certain groups of people, right? And this sort of promulgation of resentment is part of the media discourse in a way, and which is dominated really by a kind of a liberal mindset. So anything outside of that is likely to be called, alt right or far right or whatever, even where it bears no relation to any of those things historically or politically whatsoever. I mean, there's nothing inherently right wing about wanting to look after yourself and get fit. I mean, the left, for example, used to be extremely critical of big pharma. If you read Illich and if you read, many left and up until quite recently, the left were very skeptical of consumerist and pharmacological solutions to health problems. The left would say you need to look after your own health and eat healthily and exercise and do all these things. And now suddenly these things are attached to the right, which doesn't really make any sense unless you imagine that left liberal governments are quite happy for you all to die, which is probably the case, frankly.
Oh, well, that's cheerful. I was going to accuse you of harboring cruel optimism in the book, but I think that's just been wiped away in that one statement. But look, we've taken ourselves into industrial towns and white working class men, and that's something that I think is quite important to dwell on for maybe a little bit longer, because the preoccupation of some of the critical apparatuses that we engage with, I think, is never to do with those kind of communities. But on the back of this, I want to ask you about your method. So, in as much as we're not really going to find out what men want, because that's a fool's errand, as it was with Freud, how much time did you spend in the former Red Wall working class communities in northern England talking to men outside nightclubs? I mean, this is a facetious question, but again, how can we reduce sex to this kind of monoculture again, in which in which we can separate any of these things.
Well, I mean, I say precisely again against those generalizations, that the question of class rarely comes into those generalizations that are being made about toxic masculinity and so on, and actually this idea of male privilege clearly doesn't really apply to people who are living, to men who are dying of like opioid overdoses in like poor parts of America, or, men who are committing suicide because they don't have any social role. I think the reduction to sex is something that's happening elsewhere, in a way. It's like I'm saying sex is real. Absolutely. Sex is real. It's important. And we can't kind of hand wave it away. But sex doesn't tell you anything about how you're going to live your life. It doesn't tell you anything about the meaning you attach to sex and so on. It just says that it's a fact. And, there may be other more salient facts when you look at somebody's life. Questions of class and geography and all of these kinds of things. At the same time, we can talk about broader trends. So the movement in employment in this country, the kind of destruction of manual labor where men dominated, took place quite a long time ago at this point, in my lifetime, but under Thatcher, and the very deliberate political shift towards what might be described as feminized work. And this is what I discussed in the first book, about the feminization of labor and the way in which employment is moving towards things that don't require kind of forms of physical labor and physical skill. And in that sense, everyone has sort of become womanish, and at least those are the sort of skills and values that are rewarded. And I think we can also see this negatively in the kind of social online sphere where everyone has become like a mean girl and sort of pathetically bitchy. Whereas I think people should, men should go back to sorting out things like with duels and, face to face and
Duels.
yeah.
Right. I mean, I happen to know that earlier this week you you were pretty much cut off by a producer of the BBC for saying something similar. So
Yes.
should I offer you an opportunity to expand on this thought
Sure.
and advocate violence in the street?
Yes, I think that, what we're talking about, especially when we're talking about male energy, men are more violent than women. They're responsible for the vast majority of interpersonal violence against each other, against themselves, and against women. The question of how a culture deals with male violence is obviously always very important. You can ritualize it. You can make it to do with sports. You can make it to do with sex. You can make it to do with culture. You can repress it and you can generate other things as a consequence. I don't think we're ever going to eliminate male violence, but we obviously want to, let's say, direct it, not towards situations which destroy the social fabric, but rather improve it. And so my joke, it's it's slightly jokey, I suppose, but if we have a world in which male violence is not expressed in the correct way, not ritualized, not a matter of etiquette, as in the duel, it will come out in other ways that are not necessarily better either. And I think this kind of condemnation, again, of these generalizations about men being violent and rapists and so on, is actually worse, far worse than my optimistic claim, which is to say that most men are not like this. Most men will never rape or murder anybody. We're all capable of harm. We're all apex predators, after all. And so, but at the same time, to offer men this idea of improvement, the same as we can all improve, and to channel their negative energies into more structured and ritualistic activities. So I suggest we might need to come up with new rituals because there aren't very many rituals left in our culture.
Do you have suggestions?
Well, I mean, I guess there's lots of, people play football and, maybe a bit more wrestling. I think people shouldn't be afraid to wrestle.
People shouldn't be afraid to wrestle. I mean,
No.
that's a pull quote for when we typed this up. I've been thinking about. I think your book touches on this and with our conversation so far now. But I keep on thinking in debates to do with equality about the question of solidarity and how somehow the two are almost contradictory. And you've essentially alluded to this, how the denial of difference somehow doesn't really allow for that much productive exchange between agents who are different. like what happens to solidarity? How can people live together and exchange their values when there's no difference between them? Like what happens when all neoliberal subjects are equal, but by that virtue equally weak?
Yeah, I mean, there's a rich history of kind of socialist and Marxist feminism on this topic. I mean, if you read Kollontai, she's very interested in precisely how working class men and women can feel solidarity with one another, in fact, in the midst of difference and their different experiences of childbirth, let's say, or, you know, their physical being. So I think there are, yeah, absolutely, to understand each other in an empathetic way is not to downplay the difference, but rather to engage in superior forms of imagination, to think better what it's like for the opposite sex. I think sometimes people feel terrified to do this. I don't know. I think a lot of men are very afraid to think about what female physical life is like. I think they don't want to think about motherhood or birth or any of these sort of yucky things. And I think a lot of younger women are afraid of it, thinking about it too, because it's almost too real. It's too visceral. And don't we live in a way beyond those things? Don't we live in a kind of civilized modern world that completely downplays these extremely animalistic and violent aspects of biology? And I think actually a lot of people just really hate themselves and therefore blame their mothers and therefore hate women. So I think there's like deep misogyny in our culture and deep hatred of mothers in particular, which is something that absolutely should be changed. I think when women speak in public, particularly about issues that concern them, they are often attacked in a very extreme way. And, to go back to the point about equality, there's equality in all different realms. If we're talking about political equality, are we talking about suffrage and representation? Are we talking about representation in the political discussion? This is only about 100 years old in this country. It's not, a happy business. Men and women do have conflicting desires. Women are often not listened to in this regard. We can talk about democracy as a celebration of equality. But it really depends what kind of equality we're talking about. To have universal suffrage is one thing. To imagine that therefore there are no differences between men and women is another, which is completely stupid. And I mean, like for example, women's sports. I mean, it's very obvious that women are not as strong as men in certain ways. They're stronger in other ways, but they're not stronger when it comes to most sports. And the idea that we can kind of ignore that or pretend that that's not a problem is just frankly really depressing for women who are experts in their field. um, and I feel like, yeah, solidarity. I feel terrible for women who train all their lives only to be beaten by some man who decided last week that he's a woman in a sporting event, for example. So I think when we talk about equality, we have to be really clear which realm we mean. Political, social, legal, I don't know, cultural, sexual, and so on. It's not just it's not just good in and of itself, just because we come to associate this word with, I don't know, progress or a progressive narrative. Equality can also be used to harm difference as well, and to actually harm groups that need different kinds of protection and segregation.
Yeah, so sport is kind of interesting. Not that I want to get into the details, but you in the book, you have I think the only one time where you really have a go at men, and it's for their behavior in the swimming pool. Apparently, we are too aggressive when you, for some reason, elect to share a lane with us. Very ill-advisedly, I have to say. So that is my one protest.
Well, I know you love swimming, yeah, and I know that you are probably
I'm very aggressive underwater.
I was
Like,
going to say,
yeah.
I thought you'd be incredibly well mannered and well behaved, as you are
No, no. I
generally.
think it's kind of decomposes. In fact, we were
So
talking earlier about.
you agree with me?
I probably agree with you on some aspects of the sports question. But you asked me earlier whether I can admit to any acts of misogyny in my life, and of course there are many because I've been awake and I've been in a street and I've met a woman before, and I also have a mother. But like, out of the like 10 incidents in my life when I'm ashamed of having said something to someone, like the most recent one is me flipping out at a at a woman at a swimming pool. And it's just the water does something to me. And of
Well,
course I
this is,
of course I
yeah.
apologized, but you thankfully wrote a book to absolve me of all my guilt later.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm not the only woman who's noticed this, but yeah, it's a sort of it was a it's a light-hearted comment, but it's to do with this. Yeah, it's these particular places where sometimes this kind of, I don't know, masculine urge to dominate and to territorialize and to take over all the room seems to have just come out.
Water is the one place in which the scent, like, we can't piss around the pool and like mark our territory. It just washes away. It's the most futile way of marking one's territory.
Yes, I mean, maybe it's a kind of interuterine memory. It's like some sort of way of trying to dominate the womb. The kind of the lack of choice.
Write that book. Do write that book,
Yeah, I
please.
mean, this is the sort of books that kind of Jungian feminists were writing in like the 70s and 80s.
I ask you facetiously about your research and how your sample size of the kinds of men that you spoke to, and how do you even conceptualize the fact that we must talk about men, an entity, that so often we end up having to talk about women. Like essentially, your book is a feminist argument. It just happens to be looking at the other side. I mean, I'm doing it a bit of an injustice here. You do actually look at your subject in quite a lot of detail, and you look at material not from the female experience
Yeah.
exclusively, but the female experience is always there. Um, Whereas in feminist conversations, men don't necessarily have to be looked at with the same level of care. And treading mildly carefully, there's also a bit of an asymmetry in some of the ideological and political conversation around trans men and trans women. Like there's one side of this transition ends up gaining something, the other maybe not so much. Do men get to be able to define themselves, as we've already mentioned, without reference to women? And is there some kind of asymmetry, which means that women are not afforded the same privilege? Like, can we have some kind of separatism that helps us ideologically or at least theoretically? And
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question and a very deep one. I wanted to write a book about men, but it did end up in large part being about the relationship between men and women, right? It's a book about heterosociality, ultimately. It's about how we get along or don't get along in the world as it is, which is a mixed world. It's not a segregated world. And I think there is maybe more room for sex segregated activities. I think maybe the pendulum has swung too far towards the mixing, and we might need to go back to having a more separate life in some ways and then coming together more beautifully at other times. I mean, of course, I'm not talking about looking after children, which would require both parents, but rather, I don't know, almost like as a kind of form of ritual behavior, to have those things. If you think about, I don't know, when people used to learn how to ballroom dance and then go to balls, and they would meet people there, but it was a rare occasion, and a very exciting one. Whereas now you can just download an app and screw someone from down the road, and who gives a fuck. You can watch Netflix and order a pizza, and it's all very boring and banal. And so I think we need some more magic and re-enchantment in this kind of frisson of difference. Um, I did look at some male separatist movements, so like MGTOW, which is men going their own way, which is a small tendency, a trend towards some men just kind of completely abandoning what they see as the corrupt dating economy. And some of these men are quite misogynist. They maybe have had a bad experience, a bad relationship or marriage that's broken down. they generalize from this bad experience, and therefore they say that all women are gold digging bitches or whatever. And then they go off and do their own thing. That's fine. I think this is, we should absolutely allow for the expression of a single life, whether it's a spiritual single life or just people who are not interested in having a partner or reproducing. And MGTOW are very big fans of Jesus, who doesn't have children unless you're a member of a weird heretical sect. They like a lot of science figures and philosophers. So there are quite a lot of very important men who didn't reproduce, and they say that 60% of men historically don't reproduce, which is actually kind of an interesting thing to think about.
Is that the case?
I don't know. I mean, it's certainly the case that actually a lot of men don't reproduce, and it's surprisingly high. And if you think about the numbers of men who were slaughtered in the world wars, who never had children, war is obviously a great sacrifice that men pay for the preservation of society, which I think is also not often acknowledged enough. That men die so that society will thrive, at least historically. So yeah, I don't know, and I try to compare that to the kind of lesbian separatist movement, which is also a very small part of 1970s feminism, and what it would actually mean to try to live in a world that has the opposite sex in it. How far can you escape? I mean, there's obviously places like Mount Athos in particular, which doesn't even have female animals. It's a male only, Orthodox island, Greek island, the monastery, and yes, no female animals, or they can't go down to the insects. So there might be female insects on the island, but there are certainly no female animals or female humans. I think the idea that everybody should be everywhere all the time is a false fantasy, and I don't know. I mean, if you look at the manosphere, these kind of this world of online men talking about men's things, there are enormous numbers of spaces where men are talking to each other and talking to themselves without women, and often being very encouraging, actually. And like the incel forums are very often about upbuilding. I mean, yeah, they're rude and jokey and filled with memes and often horrible, but there's a lot of actually mutual support for men on those places as well. Lots of men encouraging other men to get fit, stop drinking, be better, so on. Yeah, it is difficult to write a book about just men. The most masculinist books I looked at were the ones that were 30-day challenges where you had to kind of give up, porn, sex, do 300 press-ups a day. But also, interestingly, you had to read good books. This is also part of these kind of, boot camp type things. It was also about improving your mind. So a lot of this masculinist stuff is not only just about bodybuilding and looking good. It's not even really about that. It's about sorting yourself out, being fit, not being dependent on women or drugs or alcohol or the state, and also improving your mind, actually compensating for perhaps the crap education you received, and actually taking control of your own thoughts, which from a state that wants you dependent on them is quite dangerous. And I think that's why a lot of these groups are designated as alt-right or far right or whatever.
Well, there's a group you missed, and I know that you've been doing interviews back to back for the last 2 weeks. So to give you a little treat, I thought we could switch around a little bit and give you an opportunity to interview me a little bit, Nina. And the reason for this is that maybe because we were not hanging out that much when you were writing the latest version of the book during the pandemic, you failed to produce a chapter about gay men.
Yes.
And not that I particularly have anything to say, but one of the things that really came to my mind that I was reading the book is a little kind of throwaway joke that I used to make when I was in my 20s. Like someone would call me a young man, and I would faux kind of respond saying, "Oh, are you calling me a man?" Not that I'm in any sense or conceive of myself as camp, or it's kind of affectation that was produced by the company of men who, at some cultural level, still don't want to see themselves as men. The queer sphere, as it is constituted now, is filled with so many contradictions, which at one level present themselves as being so magnanimous and being an ally to everything and anyone, but it still maintains this reserves this fantastic right to be utterly misogynistic, and actually fails quite often at aspects of homosexuality that we discussed earlier. Do you have any questions for a gay man who
Yes, I mean,
is annoyed at not having been written into
no,
this particular book?
I explicitly say in the introduction, this is not a book about gay men. It's also not a book that goes into depth about sports and other things. It's also very like Western centric and, all of these other crimes. I mean, I think the reason why I didn't want to talk about gay men, although there is obviously some overlap with the kind of uh, the bodybuilding community and
Yeah.
figures like Bronze Age pervert are very interesting in their kind of provocation, where they often use very gay, the kind of classical image of male beauty for the Greeks
Yeah.
and the Romans is obviously been recoded as a kind of not only but predominantly homosexual
Mhm.
image. These kind of bronzed, rippling, bodies, right? There's a kind of
Gosh, we might need a chaperone to continue this in a
a
moment.
gay
Go on, go
but
on.
there's a kind of gay recoding of that, and somebody, like people figures in the dissident right, so called, or whatever, play around with that because it's funny, because it's like a undecidable, indeterminacy, and there is something kind of funny and ridiculous about going back to classical aesthetics and trying to resurrect them in the age of the internet. I find this very amusing, and I think, yeah, I mean, I think maybe my trepidation about writing about homosexual men, I think in my experience, gay men are either very misogynist or very philogynist, which is not a word you hear often enough.
No.
But I think there's sometimes a way in which gay men, because they're so um, not interested or even disgusted by female bodies, including their mothers' bodies, that they, um, I don't know, sort of seek to distance themselves from women in every kind of respect, and almost end up regarding women as, or sometimes as rivals, honestly, as straight men. You know, I think Douglas Murray has written about this. It's very weird to read this kind of thing, actually, to imagine oneself as a woman who likes men as being in any way a rival to a gay man. But for the gay men, I think, who want to have sex with straight men or straight acting men, then women are opposition. they're trouble. So there's that. I think we see extreme misogyny from people like Owen Jones, figures gay men on the left, and many men on the left, not only gay men at all by any means. Actually, I think a lot of heterosexual men on the left would like nothing more than being allowed to hate certain women. Women who have the wrong view or think that sex matters in particular. And honestly, the last sort of 5-6 years, the levels of male left misogyny have been extraordinary. On the other hand, I think there is sometimes a deep sympathy between gay men and women, which is much more interesting and much more complicated. And it's partly to do with an identification with a role, whether it's sexual or otherwise, but also with a kind of attitude to life itself. And I can see why in the kind of male or gay community that there is sometimes a playing with not only with femininity or camp, but also with the language of womanhood. And I think there is absolutely, this is very interesting, and I'm a strong defender of the demi-monde. I think, there is a grey area in social and sexual life which should be largely tacit, and that people can engage in and with if they like, but it's a kind of secret, private thing. It shouldn't be kind of imposed as the new way of doing things, or even celebrated, particularly, not least because I think it destroys the interesting aspects of it. So I don't know. Let's turn it back to you. I think that
Oh, I was afraid you might remember
gay.
that, but
Yeah, so so let's ask you, what do gay men want? I did actually ask a friend of mine, a gay friend of mine, what do gay men want? And he said to take drugs and fuck until we die.
Yeah, that's definitely a view that I have seen reproduced and lived out by many people. A friend of mine, Peter Darney, wrote a very successful play called Five Guys Chilling, which I guess he wrote about 10 years ago, and that was a really beautiful study of the kind of chemsex culture, which was really rampant in London at the time, and I'm pretty sure hasn't really died out that much. Maybe the drugs have changed, and maybe the prevalence of HIV has slightly dropped. I think it's almost the same fool's errand as it is with your question in your book. Gay men want the same million different things, and they're driven by the same unrealizable, unconscious desires as anyone else. In a way, the kind of conversations that you and I've had before, I've talked to you about having sexual desires that have led me to really exploit the kind of promiscuity and liberated algorithmically mandated sexual behaviors that are completely normalized within the gay community, in scare quotes, but also being able to flip within a minute towards having completely traditional desires of a stable partner and a dog, even though I have made bad jokes about how all gay men cannot face the fact that they cannot bear children, so they all want to have a dog. Like that's become kind of a substitute. But I think what has been quite interesting at the back of what you were saying about the kind of levels of misogyny and how the gay sphere has become integrated into the very activist political sphere, and that's because to be gay is no longer so special. To be gay is barely anymore a claim to some kind of protected status, which in this kind of gradation of identities, which I was, from a solidarity perspective, as I mentioned before, gay men are now, I think, probably underneath the straight man to a certain extent. The gay man who has won and enjoyed their privilege, their freedom for a long time. We've got gay marriage under a conservative government. It's all absolutely fine. As in any minority, our identities keep on multiplying and we keep on splintering to smaller and smaller bits. Just like the debates about femininity that are or feminism that are completely jamming media at the moment, whatever's happening to gay men is also manufactured for a spectacle.
Yeah.
To the personal doesn't. I mean, I would go as far as saying that the personal is not political by default in all circumstances, but it has to be because that's of use to Twitter, it's of use to Grindr, it's of use to all forms of capital, and therefore it becomes absorbed as a kind of tacit desire of the neoliberal subject. So
Yeah.
I'm afraid we're stuck in just the same way, but we have the possibility to jump at any one answer that looks kind of crystal clear at any one moment. Like the gym and Grinder, they're all completely fine, and they're all very alluring. But the one thing that you also see in your book for straight men isn't all that easy. The relationships that going on normal civilized dates and talking to people about how you feel and taking responsibility for who you are, that remains difficult. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, I mean, I talk in the book about touch and the confusion around touch today, and like the absolute fear and paranoia of intimacy, and of making a mistake, and this kind of very unforgiving culture. And it's almost like it's like you can go and watch hardcore porn in HD and then like rim someone, and then whatever. And then but actually, like, to tell someone that you like them, would be like devastating. This would be like impossible. It's like, I mean, it's such a terrible world where you can't sort of have where you can't tolerate ambiguity or difficulty in these very, very delicate ways, actually. In social life. And this is why I think people are have been turned away and are turning away from the grey areas of social life, because of an inability to bear complexity and ambiguity, because these things, they're very small, but they're very painful. It's much easier to, I don't know, find someone who'll beat the shit out of you and then, you know, eat pizza with them, than it is to
I mean,
have a
that's what I did last night on my date. But listen, you've talked about the ambiguity now. Maybe this is a good moment to get back to your optimism and ask you the last question. You talk about games and the way that men and women play games with each other in the book. And I think maybe this could be a good way to kind of leave us with with a commandment of what it is that we could all do tomorrow and later today to feel happy about who we are. Set us a game, and
Well,
hope, is it going to be Dungeons and Dragons?
no, although I did play Dungeons and Dragons. I was an elf ranger called Jebediah Moonstone. I had a bow and arrow.
I have no idea what this means.
It was
but
great. Um, a long time ago. Well, I think actually just reflection on the reality of the multiplicity of our involvement with each other. So again, to get away from these kind of dominating negative narratives and to think about all of the different relationships that we have with the opposite sex, as friends, as family, as colleagues, and a lot of these are not wholly bad or wholly good. A lot of them are fleeting, some of them are meaningful, some of them are ambiguous, some of them are complex, some of them are wonderful, some of them are both awful and great. Um, and I think, people already live in that world, this very mixed world and this very complicated world. And I think it's just maybe ignoring these sorts of forces that try to generate resentment on the basis of faulty generalizations. And I think I think there should be more grey areas, more flirting, more silliness, more light-hearted humor, and people should stop pretending to take offense for attention points.
Well, do we need a break for a hug right now? No, well, now that you've sorted out this particular set of problems, because everything's going to be fine as we get on with our games. What's next for you?
Well, I don't know. I don't have an academic job anymore. I left them all.
But you are writing no fewer than 2 books, I understand, and you have a podcast that I think
Sure,
I'd like to at least recommend to our listeners.
I do a weekly podcast called The Lack with the amazing Helen Rollins and incredible Benjamin Studebaker, where we usually discuss a film from a philosophical, political, and psychoanalytic perspective. And I have a Substack.
I'll put links to all of this in the show notes.
Yes, and I will write some more things probably soon.
Probably soon. Thank you very much, Nina.
Thanks, Pierre.
What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents by Nina Power is published by Alan Lane. I'm Pierre Delancey, and the editor is Marshall Poe. Thank you for listening, and join us next time.